Inflation, I think, as we all know, whether, you own a business, running a business, or even in your own personal life, since COVID, we've all been impacted by inflation and various aspects, whether it's filling up your car at the gas station and looking at prices at the pump or at the local grocery store and seeing what food prices have gone to. I mean, the item that got all the publicity a few years ago was eggs, right? And then beef, and now of late, it seems produce is being highlighted, and the cost, of the various food products and the impact, to the consumer, and us as producers. But when you add them all up collectively, it's been a significant impact to not only the consumer in this country, but certainly us as growers, farmers, in agriculture, whether it's specialty crops or the major row crops, such as corn and soybean and wheat, have all been impacted, primarily starting with fuel, and fuel prices, and particularly with the conflict, with Iran and the impacts, to the stoppage, and interruptions of flow of oil through the Straits of Hormuz, and what that's translated, into escalating oil prices. So much of our inputs on the farming side, in all of agriculture, doesn't matter whether in Florida or California or in Mexico for that matter, but a lot of the derivatives, our fertilizer, our chemicals, plastic mulch for those growers using plastic mulch, drip tape, is all petroleum based, and so every one of those items have been impacted with increased costs and a spike in inflation, particularly the last several years. Frank, it's really spiked up over the last few years. I mean, fertilizer prices, are probably $150 a ton more today than they were, right after COVID. And that's just one example of one input item. You take the minimum wage, the labor wages, which is our biggest cost, which is now upwards of 40% of your total input cost. In Florida, our minimum wage has gone from $10 and it'll go to $15 an hour September 30th. So that's a significant impact across the board, in your operations, whether it's farming operations or packing operations. And so many of us in agriculture, on the farming side, are reliant on, the federal H-2A program, and, looking at what those costs have done, because the adverse effect wage rate as to the H-2A program, which is the so-called minimum wage of the guest worker program, last year, for example, was $16.23 an hour, when our minimum wage in Florida was $14 an hour. So we've always paid a premium as a participant in the H-2A program because of the established adverse effect wage rate. And, up until this past year, it's gone up proportionally, typically tied to the cost of living. And there's several other factors that the Department of Labor calculates that adverse effect wage rate. So again, very, very expensive program. And we as growers, farmers, have all been impacted by the increased cost, not only to the adverse effect wage rate, but remember, as a participant in the program, we have to pay for the transportation for those workers, primarily coming out of central Mexico, to and from their country origin. We have to pay for and provide housing, and we have to provide transportation to and from the job site, along with providing either 3 meals a day or a stipend equal to that, as an employer and a participant of the H-2A program. So it's a very, very expensive program. Caveat is, unfortunately, without that program, none of us in this country as growers would be able to operate today, because we just don't have the workforce that we can go to on the domestic side to rely on to harvest our crops, whether it's tomatoes, citrus, cherries, peaches, bell peppers. It doesn't matter. Well, most growers today are solely reliant on this program. And but again, it comes at a significant cost as a participant. So these are some of the challenges and certainly examples of the increased input costs to our operations. Personally, to me, and I've been saying it for years, as I've watched the escalation of our input cost rise, particularly since COVID, but particularly the last few years, it seems like it's accelerated. They're at levels, unfortunately, I believe, that are not sustainable. And you're going to see, I believe, an acceleration of an exodus of more growers getting out of the business because from an economic standpoint, it is not sustainable. Remember, in our industry, fortunately or unfortunately, we're in a supply and demand nature. We don't have the ability to add these costs on to the cost of our product, the price of our product when we sell it because of the supply and demand nature. So that presents a significant problem. And what's happened as our input costs have gone up, our prices for the product that we're selling has remained fairly constant. I mean, it's, some years is lower than others. A lot of it's predicated on weather, such as this past year when we had multiple freezes that impacted markets for a lot of our commodities in Florida, caused prices to spike. But in my view, it's not sustainable because, again, you've had this tremendous acceleration of input costs as prices have remained, for the most part, constant. And that just doesn't add up. So your margins just continue to get squeezed year over year. And it's a very serious problem when you think about it and you talk about the potential jeopardy of losing the American farmer in this country, and what that's going to translate to for the future of this country, for our reliance on, in our industry, fresh fruits and vegetables. Where are they going to come from? They're going to come from somewhere, but it's probably not going to be the United States, unfortunately. And I don't see, short term any relief in sight. The first thing that has to happen, in my view, is you got to resolve the conflict with Iran and get oil supply back to stability to get prices back down. And then I think, on a broader scale, I do think eventually, I think interest rates are going to have to go up to address inflation. By keeping it constant, we have not addressed it. So we've got to figure out another alternative, where we can start getting inflation back in check. It's still too high. And again, we're talking about, direct input costs, we're talking about wages, but the same could be said for insurance, taxes, everything we're touching has all been impacted and gone up, and some, in some cases, significantly. Not methylbromide, but soil fumigation, right, that we're reliant on in Florida for, control of soil-borne diseases and what have you. Some of the byproducts, of the makeup of the fumigation that we use in Florida come from China. Well, when we instituted the tariff against China last year, China immediately reciprocated and put a tariff on a lot of products coming to the U.S. One of the products was a derivative of the fumigation we use, and almost immediately we're notified by our distributor in the U.S. that we were going to experience, I think it was 10 or 15% increase to the cost of fumigant for this upcoming season. So this is an example, and another one, we're talking about tariffs and the impact of tariffs on some of our inputs on products, and other industries were impacted similarly, with tariffs, whether it's from Canada or China or some of these other countries that were exporting products that we're using. There was a reciprocation and a negative impact to us in agriculture and some of these products. Fertilizer, again, is another one. So again, I don't unfortunately see any relief in the short term. But if we're going to continue relying on the U.S. farmer to provide, our food products, we're going to have to do something to get this inflation in check. Because I'm telling you, what I see and the acceleration and the rapid increase of inflation on some of these inputs are rising quicker than I think some growers realize. And you get to the end of the season and said, holy mackerel, I budgeted X. And my end result on my expenses was 30% higher than I forecasted in my budget, because things change along the way. Again, we just got notified last week from our corrugated supplier that they're going up again, another 5% on the box that we pack our product in, up from 10% last spring season. So in the packing operations, our corrugated, our box cost is our second biggest input cost next to labor. So again, how do you continue to absorb all these increased expenses, yet you don't have the ability in our industry, because of the nature of our industry, supply and demand, to add those costs on. Yet every single supplier that we're reliant on is, if they have an increase today, tomorrow they're calling you, we're going to have to raise our prices 10%. But that doesn't translate well to the grower. And that's the difference. And that's why I think you're going to see, unfortunately, an acceleration and an exodus of growers in this country, because you just can't keep up with it. I think I read this morning in one of the publications, last year there was either 156,000 or 165,000 farms that shuttered, that shut operations for whatever reason. 160,000 plus last year alone. And again, when you look at these numbers, these are red flags to me of what's happening in this country, again, for various reasons. Most of it tied to the cost of operating, and the cost of production in our business has gotten to levels that is just not sustainable long term, unfortunately.